Hello everyone, and welcome to our final video on the book of Revelation. As I've mentioned at the beginning of all of these videos, we are not aiming to go through every verse line by line, but rather we're trying to give you some background information to help you understand the book as best you can. And today it is my goal to do two things. First of all is to address the claim that exists in the New Testament that Jesus is returning soon. Well, here we are over 2,000 years later, and how do we reconcile the idea that the New Testament writers say soon? Also, what I'd like to do is give you my own personal view as I watch and weigh what's happening in the world. And I'm doing this as an example. I've mentioned to you in the past that I'm not sure it's the responsible thing to do to be trying to identify fulfillments with preciseness. We've done that so much and we've been wrong so many times. Also, it leaves open the problem that we're always waiting for something to happen and we're not able to say, well, Jesus could come back at any time. Well, no, we're waiting for all of these other things to occur. Who knows when they'll occur? And I think that we are supposed to believe that the return of Christ is imminent. We're supposed to be waiting and watching and believing that at any moment he could come back. So the second thing is that if he were to come back this week or tomorrow, how would I personally see the world, and how would I see everything in Revelation having been fulfilled already? Again, I'm not saying that it's all been fulfilled. I am saying that if Jesus comes back right away, then apparently, yes, it all has been fulfilled. And how am I viewing the world in light of what we see in Revelation? This is something you should do on your own. And I'm not asserting that all of my ways of seeing things are correct, but I think that they line up with what we understand about the end times. And these are things that for me keep me on my toes, keep me from getting too lax about the way I see life, and to know that there should be a sense of urgency in what it means to be a Christian. So back to the first question. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, it says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray." Romans 16:20, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet." And in Revelation 3, verse 11, and in 4 other places, Jesus says, "I am coming soon." So again, we've got this idea of soon affirmed by New Testament writers, and yet here we are 2,000 years later. The way I look at this idea is, first, the difference between our understanding of soon and God's understanding of soon are different. We are bound by time. We can't really speed it up. We can't slow it down. We're going to experience it in a very predictable way. I do not know how God sees time. I know that he is not bound by it. I know that he created it. I don't understand the ins and outs of how he interacts in it. But I do know that in the spiritual realm, time is not as we perceive it. So I would say that helps me in some regard with this question. But also, I believe that we as believers, and the New Testament writers also were charged with leaning into the spiritual. We are charged with seeing as best we can what God sees. And I believe that as we lean into the spiritual realm, that we sense what God senses. And that is, we become sensitized to the fact that the world is saturating with evil and that it is worthy of judgment. And as we sense that it is worthy of judgment, that we get a sense of God's pending return, and that is just a natural way to sense things. So it is good and it is right for us to sense that God's return is imminent. It's a good and right way to perceive things. It is not a healthy way to perceive things to think that, well, it's probably way, way off and I don't need to worry about it. Because we are charged to keep watch. So I think when the New Testament writers say that they believe that the end of all things is near, that's them leaning into the spirit realm and sensing what the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit live in, which is this burden of a world that is saturating with sin. So I think that although we don't know when it is time, it's perfectly reasonable for us to believe that it is soon. Which leads me into the next question. We're supposed to keep watch, and we are supposed to try to understand the times that we're living in. I don't think it's the fair thing to do to merely limit our understanding of waiting for the judgment to the book of Revelation. I think that the book of Revelation gives us a couple of new things to look out for, but what we have been looking out for precedes the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is a great summary of what we've already seen in the judgments of God beforehand. And yes, it does have a few new clues for us. So in an earlier video, I believe it was the second video, I talked about a biblical theology of the judgment of God. And what I meant by that was, if we examine the key times in Scripture where God has already come in massive judgment, can we find characteristics to understand why, how, and when God does this type of judgment? And I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to summarize some of that, and then I'll go on to talk to you about what I see. But here is a summary of the things that mark a society for destruction. 7 things. Number 1, a corruption of the thoughts and the will of each individual. The corruption of the thoughts and will of each individual. That began with Cain, and that statement was specifically made in Genesis chapter 6 as a justification before the flood. So I believe that as we each collectively bear a saturation of sin, that God looks at all of humanity in a singular. How saturated is the whole of society right now? So that's a question we have to answer. Number 2, and again, this comes from the flood. We see an ancestry being corrupted in a family line. We see that from Adam and Eve, the broken family, then on to obviously Cain. Lamech, who is a descendant of Cain, is clearly a patriarch that is promoting an ideology of his own way and turning his back on God. So we know for sure that the breakdown begins with the family and extends out to society. Number 3, societal leaders. That the leaders of the world will be teaching and affirming a way of life that is against God. That's always been, but it is important for us to continue to identify that. Number 4 comes from the Tower of Babel. It's about people making a name for themselves and their desire to not glorify the name Yahweh, the name of the Lord, but to glorify each their own individual names. They want to make a name for themselves. So what have they done? They have collectively come together to make a name for themselves and bypass the heavens. So we're looking for things that are similar to that. And number 5, sexual perversion and the grossness of sexual perversion is something that permeates society, and we can see that talked about in the New Testament quite a bit, but also something that we know factually has been part of societies that God has wiped out. Number 6, the people of God are apostate. That is something we understand by the New Testament's treatment of the word Balaam and Revelation's treatment of the word Balaam, that the people of God will be divided into the remnant, which are the true and faithful, and those who have compromised, those who have become syncretists, meaning they have not renounced the faith, yet they think they are clever enough to be able to retain their faith and adopt the world as well. That's the apostate church. So we're looking for those. And then finally, number 7 is we're looking for the church to be persecuted. That means either put to death, put in prison, or that the world has also economically and socially disadvantaged the true believers. So those are the things we look at when we want to watch and weigh. Now let me get into it. So the first thing that I would that comes to my mind when I think about the return of Christ and I look at this world we live in. Let me back up a little bit to World War II. I just got done rewatching a documentary. I initially read the book, and now I've just looked at the documentary of a gentleman named Richard Wurmbrand. He is now deceased, but he was a pastor in Romania during World War II. And it was at a time when they were testing the pastors in these communist governments. And they were basically telling them, so long as you adhere to our rules, then you are able to open your church, keep your churches open. But they were basically, for lack of a better term, they wanted them to be castrated. They wanted the churches to have no potency and basically just keep their doors open and not preach the gospel and not talk about even the fact that God is real and God exists. Richard Wurmbrand and many other pastors came out and said, no, we're not going to do that. And it is his testimony that he was imprisoned for many, many years, and he was beaten and he was tortured. And it is also his testimony that there were millions of Christians that died as a result of not renouncing their faith during that time. And it's a fascinating look. So if you want to type into YouTube Richard Wurmbrand, I'll put the spelling on the screen for you. You'll find a lot of wonderful stuff. I believe you can also still go to a site called The Voice of the Martyrs and get a free book about his life. If you can't get the book free anymore, I'll give you one. So when I'm thinking about that, we're looking at a world that was trying to be captured by an ideology. And that ideology wasn't just a political ideology. It was a political ideology that also attempted to silence Christians and persecuted and killed people who were not willing to take that silencing. I would think that at that time, Christians would have felt for sure like Jesus was just about to step onto the scene, because it really perfectly fulfills the types of things that we're seeing in Revelation, that the leaders of the world are promoting an ideology, the church is becoming apostate. You've got so many of these marks happening in an incredibly heightened way. Well, World War II came and went, and Jesus did not return. Now, that's God deciding that it's not time. And in some ways, communism, that form of communism, is still a threat, but not in any way like it was. I think we've got North Korea and we've got a couple other countries who have this really brutal type of thing where they've outlawed Christianity. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that we're not fighting a world war over it. What has changed, though? It appears to me, and again, I keep saying this, I'm not writing a book on what is. I'm giving a video on what I see. And what I see is a change in tactic by the devil. There was this overt, in-your-face ideology to eradicate God and to replace God with the government. But it seems that now we're in what's called a postmodern society. What it means to be in a postmodern society is simply that the Industrial Revolution and the modernization of the world is in the rearview mirror, and now we're firmly planted in it. We are not a world that is becoming modern. We are in a world that is fully modern. Everyone who's born today has been born into an existing world of modernism. It was not something that we transitioned into. We've all been living in it in some ways. Now, there is a new mentality that comes along with postmodernism, and it is that it's humanism and individualism, that each individual human decides morality, that each individual human has to have the freedom to have an autonomous interpretation of what life is, and that anything about religion or God is a brainwashing and something that should be completely avoided. We've essentially gone down this road in a whole new way. And now, obviously, we've seen new levels of this postmodern thinking. It really was very popular in the 60s, and the hippie movement had this idea too. It's countercultural. It's existential in the way that it takes everything that we've always known to be right and true and decided that it's only a societal construct. It's man-made societies that have created religion. It's man-made societies that have created marriage and what we believe about sexuality, and everything is constructed. So we need to deconstruct it all, and each individual should reconstruct it on their own. This is the new ideology. Okay, this has been around a long time. It's merely that it's progressed so much that we have literally come to the point where we have a large contingent of our world saying that gender doesn't even exist, or gender can be completely redefined by the mind, regardless of the history of humanity and regardless of whatever science might have even proven, that the mind and our ability to construct our own reality supersedes scientific data. And it's taken a long time, and there have been many steps to arrive here. The postmodern movement did not arrive at transgenderism in a night. It arrived here, it looks like overnight, but those seeds started to get sown probably at the same time that cities became prominent, and probably at the same time that the celebrity culture rose out of the Roaring 20s. And it's been a long, slow road here. But it's not been that long of a road. It's been 100 years. 100 years of essentially modernism and postmodernism. And this is where we've arrived. We have arrived in a world that each individual human being has transcended and transitioned into a God. Each individual has the right to set their own morality, and no other individual has the right to challenge that person's ideology. And wokeism, as we call it now so affectionately as Christians, was born out of postmodernism. Make no mistake that it is the child of postmodernism. And we live in a world where, it's kind of funny. Each individual is their own God, but we're pantheists. We, as individuals, are the supreme God. Yet we have other gods that we draw strength from. And those are called celebrities. Those are athletes, and those are musicians, and those are people of influence. We have all this thing called influencers now, which is a very recent term. We have authors, we have filmmakers, and instead of having one or two of them, our pantheon of gods is 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 other gods. And we don't even consciously worship. This is the trap of the devil. Instead of consciously worshiping, we unconsciously worship them. What is worship? Worship is time, attention, emotion that makes its way into our will. And we actively seek out giving our time and attention to these things. We don't put child bodies on an altar of sacrifice. It's probably happening, but it's just not what it used to be. What we do now is abortion, which essentially is the same thing. Back in the day, they said, well, we need to offer some sacrifices of small children, something the most precious we can probably think of, to get what we want from the gods. And now what do we want? Well, we're the gods, so we need to sacrifice the child so we can continue our own selfish pursuits, that we will not be derailed from self. And if we have to murder a child and abort a child in order to maintain our own road of selfishness, then we'll certainly do it. So I think that what used to be very overt things that were up in your face and very black and white, like communism or child sacrifice. Satan's tactic here in these days is very covert, and it's very indirect. Yet, with the population the size of the world that it is today, that the amount of evil pouring out from the world is at an astounding rate. So again, my first look at this is postmodernism, woke ideology, and a culture that is saturated in celebrity worship. So I tied all of this also into what I talked about with 666, the number of the beast. What is that? 666 is a mocking of the Trinity. The number 7 is the number of perfection. And the Godhead is 3, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So we have 3 repeats of 6, which is a mocking of the Trinity. It's a counterfeit. The best I can see is that the counterfeit God of this age is the individual and the postmodern mindset. So that could certainly be a very strong fulfillment of what the Antichrist is. It may not be a particular individual, but the manifestation of postmodern thinking, which has not one singular God, but each individual person has transitioned into a God, obviously small g with quotes. So I look at that idea. The next one that concerns me about our world is the internet. Now, of course there's good things. You're watching this on the internet. I'm not saying there's nothing good about it. But when we look at the Tower of Babel, we see humans trying to make a name for themselves and bypassing God, saying we don't need God, we'll make a name for ourselves, we'll reach the heavens, we'll access all the power we need on our own. And they're doing it in some sort of technological way. And one of the things God says is that he's going to confuse their language. And the languages get confused and people get dispersed. And this seems to slow things down as far as the saturation of evil. But what we have here is something that is so new to our world. And again, this idea begins, 400 years ago, 500 years ago with the invention of the printing press. And we've, for worldwide communication, we've gone from that all the way into the internet, which is an instantaneous and constant 24/7 dissemination of ideologies and ideas that is constantly being updated in real time. It's something quite extraordinary if we take a breath and think about what it really does. I think there are some similarities between the internet and the Tower of Babel. First of all, the Tower of Babel has broken down the language barrier. This is the first time in human history since the Tower of Babel that we no longer have a language barrier in the world. That there are so many pieces of software that are capable of breaking down translation barriers in seconds. And AI is making that faster and faster. So that somebody who is watching a video in China just needs to hit one button if that video is in English, and they can see the translation immediately. And the translations are pretty good. So that is an odd thing to me, that it's been this long, but now we have arrived at a place where there is no, all of the languages of the world do not divide us at all. And we're all of one language now, and it is a digital language. So that's concerning, and that gets my alert up. But also, this is the ultimate way that each individual expresses themselves as an individual. You want to talk about, we want to make a name for ourselves? Everybody on the internet has, exponentially grown the number of celebrities in the world overnight. We have a new thing, we call them influencers. They're almost like lower level gods, and you literally follow them. The dissemination of evil and the ideologies of evil are able to be saturating the world in real time and saturating them very quickly. So the world is able to change very, very quickly. Yet, between AI and the evil human mind, so much of everything we're seeing isn't even real. I mean, even one post that a person makes has gone through several filters, let alone news stories and pictures. And every day I see people, thousands of comments on pictures that I can clearly identify as AI. They're fake, they're not real. We have now been able to fake people's voices and indistinguishable to the person themselves. They don't even know that it's not their voice until it says something that they would never say. So this tool of the internet is able to expedite evil and sexuality in an alarming rate. So it's concerning to me when we look at Jesus coming back. The next thing I would look at, we talk about one of the things that marks a society for destruction is the saturation of terrible forms of sexuality. And I don't know that I even need to comment on that. I think that when we're looking at pornography, when we're looking at what was acceptable to put on television 25 years ago and what's acceptable to put on television now, and the fact that we don't even watch television, we watch the internet, and even if something is marked as unacceptable, all the 6-year-old has to do is click one button that says they're 18 and they're straight through. So there's no more barriers on who can watch what, and every imaginable thing is out there. And in the last, I think, 5 years also, the amount of pornography has gone through the roof because they have a site now where college girls can post pornography and get income from it, and the world is just saturated, even with the mindset that that's a completely legitimate thing to do. Sex trafficking and child sex trafficking is an evil and an ill that has been around forever, but because of the internet and because of the world we live in, it's now an alarming epidemic that it's hidden, but it is absolutely everywhere. And with that, I would put, the evil of child sacrifice and abortion. It is something we need to continue to educate people on. We need to continue to fight for human life. Yet the world has this very covert way of sneaking it in so that we're not putting children on an altar and bringing down a knife and burning children at some religious altar. The devil and the human ego has found a way to make much of today's evil, quote unquote, covert. Next, the apostasy of the church. I believe that the internet has also sped up the apostasy of the church. The biblical illiteracy among churchgoers is staggering. They don't read the Bible much anymore. They don't care to know more about it. Therefore, they're very, very easily manipulated. I believe capitalism has brought a lot of great things to the world. But as far as the church goes, many churches operate exactly like a business. They talk about Jesus, they talk about loving Jesus, they have a lot of spiritual things they might do, but the decision making is all from a business model. It's all a CEO mindset translated into the church, and not a Christ leadership mindset translated into the church. And that is very, very alarming. That is the world taking over the church. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's looking at that. It is totally and completely hidden, and it's almost always just accepted as a good and healthy way. Hey, if this type of thing is good for businesses and they are growing and expanding franchises because they're using certain methods and models, then the church just should do it. And instead of saying, what did Jesus say? They just say, well, since this is the world we live in, we have to run churches the same way. And nobody's discussing it. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's looking at the churches in Revelation and the admonishments that Christ gave and examining their churches in light of those. They're examining their church in light of other churches, and then they're examining their church in light of other types of business and organizational practices that are accepted. And that's just, that terrifies me. There are a million other forms of apostasy in the church. I don't really have time to get into all that, but that's one I thought I would point out. And then finally, the thing that I'm looking at, this is the thing I don't see, but might be happening, and I just don't see it. In the last times, we are looking for the church to be persecuted in a heavy way. If that is happening, I don't really see it. Now, that could be because it's just not reported. I mean, it could be happening so much and no one's reporting it because major news outlets just wouldn't report it. But I will say that in proximity to us was World War II. I know that seems like a long time ago for you, but historically we've just exited it. It's just in the rearview mirror as far as history books will look. And at that time, there were millions of Christians who were dying for their faith and heavily, heavily persecuted. So those are the things that I see. That's the way I'm looking at things. And those are the things that cause me to say, it wouldn't surprise me if those clouds opened up and I saw him. So thank you for hanging out with me for a long time. I learned a lot through doing all of these studies, and I thank you for joining me. I'm thinking about a couple of different things I could do in the future, but thank you so much for joining me for this Revelation study.